I wanted to begin by acknowledging how important Hong Kong is to my own development as a scholar and a thinker. I came here in 2009 for 2010. I worked with all 8 of the universities and did some work with the 2-year STE institutions as well. And I know that I've been working with general education for 15 years now, and that occurred right in the middle. And I know that I am who I am as a scholar and as a thinker and as a teacher because of my experiences here. So I wanted to acknowledge that immediately. I'm very grateful to Hong Kong, and I'm very grateful to be invited back by the FSTE. I also wanted to say, make it clear right from the beginning that I've worked with universities at many different levels across the United States, 3 or 4 dozen different institutions, and in Asia as well. And I've never anywhere encountered anything like the FSTE, both in terms of the cooperation amongst the organization, but also I think in terms of the vibrancy, the thoughtfulness, the degree of dialogue, the exchange of ideas, the openness to new ideas. I did a workshop yesterday and was just delighted by the energy in the room and the openness and the engagement. So it's really been a delight. So excellent work, and thank you so much for allowing me to be part of that work. The third point I think I wanted to make is that everything I'm going to say here was in Thomas's cartoons, so I'm done. I don't really have anything to add, actually. But I wanted to let you know that the talk I'm about to give is really the culmination of my thinking as someone who's been a professor and a scholar for 25 years, 28 years, depending on how you count it. And to the extent that it's the culmination, it's also very much a work in progress. So I don't know that we'll have time here for question and answer, but please know that if you have ideas or thoughts about the ideas that I'm going to present here, I would very much like to hear them. I'll give you my email address at the end and my Twitter account, but also just feel free to approach me and talk to me. I know I'm very tall, but I'm very nice. I also noted when all the guest speakers were up here that I was the youngest guest speaker with the least amount of hair, and that didn't seem fair. All right. I'd like you to look at the following items, just for a moment. I'm tempted to say, what do they all have in common? What they all have in common is that there are situations we're facing today. I'm tempted to say they also have in common the fact that they're all problems, but I don't know that you can necessarily look at Brexit as a problem. It was a surprise, it was unanticipated, but it wasn't a problem that we necessarily saw coming. I feel very confident in saying that the results of the 2016 presidential election were a problem. But I will also say that as it was occurring, we didn't necessarily consider it to be a problem. It was simply a situation, an unanticipated situation. And it continues to be an unanticipated situation. Obviously with terrorism, with ISIS, with the IS, that's a situation, that's a challenge, it's a unique challenge. We haven't really faced it before. We're in conflict with a nation state that is neither a nation nor a state, that has no clear hierarchy, that has no capital of any sort. But the environment, we knew that was coming. We've known for years and years and years that this is a problem, but how to respond to it. And again, the solutions there seem very obvious, very simple, but somehow we can't seem to get some major portions of the population, at least in my country, on board. And then a situation like urban planning in Hong Kong, I don't want to call it a problem, because I'm not from Hong Kong, but every morning when I've picked up the newspaper since I've been here, there has been something about it. Hotels are being knocked down for more business buildings because tourism is down. Housing is very expensive. Young families have trouble finding housing that's affordable. Victoria Harbor in the last 100 years has been reduced by 40%. So it's a challenge. It's an issue. So I don't know what they have in common other than they have perhaps nothing in common. I want to present the idea that they are wicked problems. Okay, and I want to be very careful about explaining what I mean by wicked problems. I know the traditional understanding of wicked is something that is sinful, something that is evil, something that does not behave the way we want it to behave. And that last bit, that idea of not behaving the way we want it to behave, I think is the best answer that I can give. I encountered the term for the first time when I was here in Hong Kong, and I was working with a gentleman named Edwin Ko, who was at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He was Stanford trained, he worked at Carnegie Mellon, and then he was at HKUST. And his point was that engineers regularly face what they call wicked problems. A wicked problem is a problem where the dynamics are constantly changing, constantly in flux. They're unpredictable. And his basic argument was that if engineers are going to face wicked problems, they need to have wicked tendencies. So here we define wicked problems are defined. Dynamics of parameters are constantly moving. They're unpredictable. These problems are resistant to resolution. Sometimes we find that works in one situation, and then the next time it occurs, that resolution doesn't work at all. The data is incomplete. Sometimes we know exactly what we're dealing with, other times we don't. I don't know if you've heard of the Zika virus that occurred in South America. We've known about the Zika virus for 30 years. Then it suddenly evidenced itself in South America, and then it suddenly came across to North America, but we don't know what's causing it necessarily or why it's evidencing. We don't know what the consequences are going to be. So the evidence is incomplete. The data is incomplete. Sometimes the data is contradictory. With the 2016 election, the data showed there was an 81% chance that Hillary Clinton was going to win that election. She did not win that election. Well, she did, but she's not president. Perhaps, yeah, the Electoral College is a wicked problem. The problems themselves are sometimes difficult to recognize. And again, the 2016 United States election is a good example of that. We didn't know what was happening. The term fake news was a term that I had never heard until the morning after the election. So the idea that somehow we were receiving information in this country, that large portions of the population of the United States was receiving information that wasn't accurate and wasn't true, and that was being deliberately generated in order to deceive, that idea wasn't even out there. Nobody even realized it was there. So a wicked problem in many ways is comparable to fixing the ship that has a hole in it as you're sailing it across the ocean, or changing the tire on a bicycle as you're riding it. Things are moving very quickly, things are changing very quickly, things are very unpredictable. We don't know what the solutions are going to be. And Edmund Coe, as I said, made the argument that if engineers are going to face wicked problems, they need to have wicked competencies. The point I think I want to make here is it's not just engineers facing this. I think all of our students, no matter what field they are in, no matter what fields they're studying, no matter what jobs they take on, are moving into a wicked world, a world where the problems are unpredictable. So the workplace itself is changing. There are new technologies. Sometimes those technologies are the solutions, sometimes those technologies are the problems. The technologies we teach them to work with today are irrelevant 3 years from now. Globalization, there's new markets, new clientele, new opportunities, but also new cultures with new challenges. With the mainland Chinese students looking for education in all different sorts of places, there are universities in the United States who saw this as a wonderful opportunity. We will bring all these Chinese students over here, we will charge them full tuition, we will get a lot of money from having these students here. Very problematic because, of course, they didn't consider any of the culture. Here's what I'd like to propose. Well, first of all, I'd like to say this. If this were the answer, we would be done already. My talk would be over. Okay? Because this is what we do, right? Most of the time. Here's what I'd like to suggest. Content knowledge is crucial. I am not, and I will not ever argue that they don't need to learn a field, that they don't need to learn information, that they don't on occasion need to memorize that information. Content knowledge is crucial. Skills are crucial. I will never argue that they don't need to know how scientific methodology works, that they don't need to know how to do a careful exegesis or analysis of a text, literary or otherwise. They need that skill in order to work in the good world. But I'm also going to make the argument that it's not just what they know and what they know how to do, but it is also something of a sense of who they are and of what they're capable of. So I'm going to offer this idea here, that in addition to content knowledge and skills, they also need to have a sense of their ability to engage in the meaningful and difficult questions of the day. They need to have a sense that when they walk into the room and they look at the line workers and they look at the line managers, that they have the ability, that they have the right to engage in this conversation, and that's, to some extent, they have an obligation to engage in this conversation. Okay? Unfortunately, this is not a pat little phrase that works very nicely and easily translated, so I've developed my own term for this. I call it authority. And I want to be very careful when I start talking about authority here, particularly in the current political context in my country, but in other countries as well. Here's what I do not mean by authority. I do not mean bossiness. I do not mean domination. One person standing at the front of the room and telling everybody else what to do. That is not what we're after here. We're not all after authoritarianism either. I do not mean arrogance or confidence, a sense of self. Oh, I can do that. I know how to do that. No, that's not what I'm talking about. Because a person can have confidence that they can solve a problem, and they can be wrong. Same, frankly, with the term efficacy. Efficacy is not their ability to solve a problem. It's their sense of their ability to solve the problem. I'm after something more than that. And by the way, I'll also say that the term agency doesn't necessarily work for me either. Agency to me implies their ability to act on the world, but not necessarily change the world. Part of the reason I've chosen the term authority is because, for me, it's not confidence. It actually comes from something. A person can have confidence that comes out of nowhere, and they can be completely wrong about. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in authority because authority comes from something. Let me illustrate it this way. Content and knowledge are crucial. They lead to authority. Once students know the content, once they've mastered the content, that helps to develop their sense of authority. But I want to take it a little bit further than that. Authority also relates to the idea of authorship, of writing, of creating, of making something new. Okay? So in this way, authority draws from content and skills. It's not based on nothing. It's based on their learning. But it also looks forward and says, what can I do now? What do we need to do now? How do we create something new? Goran Theraborn, the Swedish philosopher, has the idea that ideology, he says, is a belief about what is true, what is good, and what is possible. And he makes the point that what is true and what is good and what is possible is not fixed. It evolves over time. And I think what I mean when I say authority and authorship is I want our students to know that what is true and what is good and what is possible, particularly what is possible, is changing, and that they are capable of being part of that change, and particularly in thoughtful ways. All right? So, as wicked educators, how do we create wicked students? First off, I'm going to just make this argument. You can't stand in a room and say to a person, here's how you be wicked. Okay, now give that back to me on a test. Oh good, very good. You've memorized how to be wicked, you are now a wicked person. Okay, it doesn't work like that. It's any more than teaching a person how to swim works by saying, okay, you swim by getting in the water and moving your arms and kicking. Okay, you've taken the test, you're a swimmer, you're fine, and then you can't actually swim, right? So it's not about just hearing an idea. In order to become wicked, you have to do wicked. Okay? Second thought, we already have lots of data on how to create wicked students. George Koo did some work back about 10 years ago looking at high-impact practices. Again, he was working with a data set of about 20,000 different students. And he found out that there are Some things that if we do them, the more students engage with these activities, the more they have these educational experiences, the more they move into the world capable of engaging in meaningful, thoughtful change. So first-year seminars, study abroad, undergraduate research, collaborative assignments, internships, capstones, community-based learning. And recently he's added e-portfolios to this. Okay? So we already have some stuff that we know that works. Now, I love this stuff. I love high-impact practices. With my work in general education these days, I'm moving more and more away from a distribution model and more towards a model that emphasizes high-impact practices at the center of the curriculum. Problem is, these are also high-resource practices and high-energy practices, so we can't happen in every situation. So I kind of like to focus on what can we do in our ordinary classes? What can each of us do to help create a context where students are enacting wickedness, enacting the kinds of thoughtfulness, enacting the kinds of change thinking that we want them to do? And I'm going to offer 3 different ideas. Oh, I'm sorry, I got a little bit ahead of myself. I'm going to draw a little bit from Randy Bass, who's a theorist at Georgetown University. Thinking about high-impact practices, he makes the argument that they work because they do several things very well. They offer the students the opportunity to integrate, synthesize, and make meaning. In other words, that making meaning, integrating and synthesis, is not just, here, learn fact A, B, and C. It's take A, B, and C and make something completely new. Okay? Making something new. Second, they ask students to do this in the midst of uncertainty, where there are no answers at the back of the book. I mean, the reason an internship works so well to teach wicked competencies is because the students are out in the real world, and if they're doing a social work service learning project, guess what? The clients aren't going to behave the way the textbook told you they would behave. And if you're doing an internship for teaching, the students in the room aren't going to behave the way that the textbook told you they're going to behave. And so this, in the midst of uncertainty, is really a replication of what it's like to be beyond the classroom. Engineers use the term, in contrast to the term wicked, they use the term tame. So much of what we do in our classes is tame. We give them questions they've seen before. We give them assignments where the answers are clear. So whatever we do in our classes, we want integration, we want synthesis, we want the making of meaning, and we particularly want it in the context of uncertainty. All right? Let me give you a couple examples. I'm going to hit 3 different ideas. I'm going to talk about projects and papers, I'm going to talk about exams, and I'm going to talk about day-to-day pedagogies. I know there's a couple people who were in my workshop yesterday. You're going to hear some repetition here. Okay? Projects and papers. Here's what we know. Anytime a student does an oral presentation or writes a paper, Aristotle tells us there's 3 rhetorical elements in flux. There's the student with limited experience talking about a topic that's been discussed in the field for years that is so important that an instructor has actually formed a class around this topic. And they are writing or speaking to a professor with unlimited experience in a grade book. Okay? Here's really what that looks like. The students way down here staring up at this topic, they've only been studying this for 12 weeks. And a professor who's got a PhD or an advanced degree in this field and is looking down at them with a grade book going, oh, don't worry. No, you're fine. You know? So it's kind of overwhelming odds for the students. And what happens in this situation, where is all the responsibility for knowledge here? Well, the student is expected to have some of it, but they know that the real knowledge exists here. This is the expert. And I have to be an expert enough to impress this person, but I don't actually have to own the information. It doesn't have to become mine. I don't have to be the expert on it. What I'd like to do is suggest something like this. Can we think of situations when we're talking about papers, when we're talking about oral presentations, when we're talking about quantitative reasoning, when we're talking about exams, where it's not the audience who has all the power, but the student who has all the responsibility. They need to own the information. They need to know what's going on. Biologist on this board. The other people are contractors, maybe they're politicians, maybe they're city planners, but they're the only marine biologist. So the student is responsible for explaining to everybody else on that board what are the impacts of building in the harbor a little bit more on the marine life. Okay? What happens in this situation is all the responsibility falls on the student. They can't rely on the professor to know the information. They can't gloss over anything. They can't cite the professor's lecture or something that was said in the book. They have to be the ones who own the information. And notice as well, it's still a research paper. I mean, there's nothing different about that. Another example, art and community murals. This is a first-year seminar that I encountered from a professor at Wellesley College in Dover, Delaware. It asks first-year students to go into the community, to find a particular location in the community, to find a particular challenge to that community, and to find and develop an art project that speaks to that community and that problem. It asks them to take on great responsibility and to enact it in a world that's complex. And to think a little bit about not just, okay, here's what the book told you, but how are you going to find out what the people in the community want? And that's going to be an unpredictable thing. Let's think a little bit about exams. Yes, it is essential on our exams that we test content knowledge and skills. And again, I just want to emphasize that point. I'm never going to make the argument that the content doesn't matter. We still need to test that. We still want students to know that stuff. That said, isn't there also room to test integration? Isn't there room to test synthesis and meaning-making in context of uncertainty? In other words, especially when those are the kinds of challenges students are really going to face. So can we ask them a question like this in a biology course? Argue for or against the feasibility of a dragon, drawing on a work from this semester. Okay. Now it's ridiculous, right? Dragons don't exist. Maybe they can exist, maybe they can't exist, but this is a problem the student has never seen before. There's no answer for this in the textbook. You could also make it a Pegasus. You could also make it a sea monster. Okay, anything you want. But they have to draw on this problem that they have not encountered, and they have to think about it, and they have to come up with the answers using the real content, using the real skills, but with a situation there's no real answer. Of course, what changes in a situation like this is you're no longer saying to them, tell me the right answer. What you're saying to them is there is no right answer, but I want to see the way your brain thinks in these unpredictable situations. Here's another one from a literature course. Or maybe not. There we go. Here's a poem you've never seen before. Tell me who wrote it. Okay. Here's what I like about this one. Say I teach a class on the Victorian poets of the 19th century Britain. For this question, I could give them a poem from the 20th century. I could give them a poem where they have no idea. It completely doesn't fit the era. I don't care. I'm not expecting them to get the right answer. The right answer isn't what I'm after. What I'm after is the quality of the thought, the quality of the thinking. Okay? And the dynamics change. They're not getting graded on the answer. They're getting graded on the process. Any class, any field. This is risky. Try this sometime. You'll get some very interesting answers. Any class. What did you learn here that matters? And why does it matter? Again, no right answer. Notice, though, it's still using the content of the course. It's still using the methodologies of the course. Try this sometime. Sometimes you'll get answers that will delight you. Delight you. A business student saying, I never thought art mattered before. Now I get it. Other times you're going to get answers where you're like, uh-oh, I maybe need to think about my course a little bit more. Third area, day-to-day pedagogies. If we're going to be giving them these strange questions, we have to prepare them for the strange questions. It's not fair to suddenly change the rules on them. They grew up with one system of education. Here's the content, give the content back to me. Here's the content, give the content back to me. If you give me more content back, you get a better grade. If you don't give me as much content, you get a lesser grade. So we're changing the rules on them. And of course, if you're going to change the rules on them, that's inappropriate unless you prepare them in your class over the course of the semester for these changed rules. So, a couple ways to think about this in a couple different fields, and then I'll end my talk. In the field of writing, here's the way traditional paper conferences normally work. The instructor gets the papers the night before. The instructor stays up all night reading as many of these papers as they can and making comments on all of the papers to decide what the student needs to do to make this paper better. The instructor then walks into the conference the next day, the student comes in, sits down, and the instructor says, here's what you need to do. And the student diligently takes notes. I will do what the teacher tells me to do. Okay? That's how traditional conferences work. Here's what I want to suggest. No pre-read conferences. You collect the papers ahead of time, right? Good, fine. You don't read them. What happens is when the student walks into your class, then you pick up their paper, and then you skim it very quickly. Okay? You glance through it. You get a good sense of what's going on, of what's good, and what's not so good. While you're doing that, though, you say to the student, okay, I want you to take your notebook out, and I want you to do 3 things. I want you to make a list of all the changes you already know you're going to make. And, there are students in the room, you know this, right? You turn in the first draft of the paper, and you're like, yeah, I could do that better, but I ran out of time. Right? So changes they already know they're going to make, changes they're considering, but they're not really sure about, and any questions that they have for you. And then you have a conversation about that. But the conversation is driven not by the professor saying, here's what you need to do. It's driven by the professor saying, what are you going to do? This is your paper after all. This is your thinking after all. Tell me what you're going to do. And then the instructor responds, oh, that's an excellent idea. Or goes, well, you might want to, maybe not that, but try, So, but the student's in charge. It's their paper, it's their responsibility. It falls on the student, not on the professor. Another technique in computer science, this is a very basic one, and I'm sure a lot of you already use it, but I just want to foreground that we're already doing some of this, and we should be more deliberate about it. In class, the instructor demonstrates a problem, and gives them several simple problems to work with. Easy enough, right? Here's how you do this algorithm. Here are some things, do the algorithm. Then, the instructor gives them a problem that's pretty much like what they just did, but slightly different. And says to them, okay, what are you going to do now? And they work in groups. Sometimes they work in groups early in the semester. Later in the semester, the instructor has to do. So it's skill, skill, skill plus. And this can occur in any field. Computer science, accounting, literature. Here's an idea, familiar, 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 but a little bit different. Get used to change, get used to the unpredictable. Geoscience, pretty basic. Again, some of these things are things we're already doing. The early data sets that they give the students, soil samples, are pretty simple. They've got some information in them that is relevant, they've got some information in them that is relevant, and the conclusions are pretty clear. This sounds familiar to some of the people who were there yesterday. Middle data sets, a little bit more noise, information that doesn't really matter, but and slightly more complicated solutions. Final data sets, lots of noise, a lot of detritus, and almost any answer is relevant as long as the student is capable of arguing for it. I will make an interesting argument here that this geoscience example is very similar to teaching literature, right? We begin with a simple poem and we say to the student, what does this poem mean? And it's pretty clear what the poem means, so they tell it to us. And we say, okay, well, here's a harder poem. What does this poem mean? Well, they go, well, it could mean this, or it could mean this. And then we give them a 400-page novel, and we say, well, what does this mean? And they say, well, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this. And again, what we're grading them on, what we're responding to, what we're paying attention to, is not the answer necessarily, but the quality of the thinking. Because that's finally what's going to get them there. And I'm also going to make this point, that the more they have these kinds of problems in the everyday classroom, the more they have a sense that they're capable of dealing with things that they've never seen before. Because that's what the world looks like. In summary, the world's full of complex problems that often don't match the static or routine dynamics of our classroom. We try, but our textbooks have answers at the back. We need to prepare students for this world. It means taking them beyond memorization of content and skill. Now, again, content and skill is crucial, but it needs more than that. It means addressing students' sense of who they are and of how capable they are of engaging the world in thoughtful, meaningful change. And to get them there, it requires more than us just standing at the front of the room and talking about it. They must do it. They must.
Thank you very much, Professor Hanstedt. And now we are welcome questions from the floor to Professor Hanstedt.
Okay. I'm just trying to get through here so I can show you email if you want. Questions, thoughts, ideas, concerns? Yes, please.
Excellent. What's the difference between integration and synthesis? For me, they look the same.
Yeah.
In your mind, there are some differences.
I think there are probably some subtle differences between integration and synthesis. I think of integration as something that occurs more on a large scale. Integration of courses, integration of topics, integration of ideas, where I think synthesis is a smaller activity that occurs oftentimes intellectually. But I don't think there's as much of a difference in my head as you might have perceived. So I think I'm glad you raised that because it's slightly perhaps redundant to my talk. So good. Over here, yes?
Paul?
Yes.
Can you elaborate more on your experience of using the proposed pedagogies in your teaching and how the students respond? Yes.
Yes. I think let me use the example of the no read paper conference, okay? Because I have a background in writing. Oh, I'm sorry, I use the microphone. I always assume I'm so loud that I don't need a microphone. Thank you. I will use a microphone. I'm going to use the example of the no pre-read conference, okay? Two things. One is that it makes students uncomfortable the first time they encounter it because it is contrary to their educational experience so far. Okay? They've been successful, or relatively successful, getting through secondary education by simply doing what the teacher tells me to do. And so if I write a paper and the teacher says X, Y, and Z, the way to get a good grade is to do X, Y, and Z. Okay? So it makes them uncomfortable at first. But the reason I began to embrace this pedagogy is more and more often. Understand that when you teach writing, very much similar to when you teach mathematics, you have students come into your classroom and they say something like, I can't write, I'm a bad writer, I've never been a good writer, I'm never going to be capable of writing. Okay? Same with mathematics, I've never been good at math, I simply can't do math. Okay? Many of my poets say that to me. So you have that attitude. And more I began to embrace this approach because more and more I would see students come in and hand me something they never thought they were capable of. More and more I would find students suddenly having a voice, having ideas, losing that perspective of I'm never going to be able to do this. So first thing, it makes them uncomfortable. The rules are changing. Second thing, it does give them a sense of power. They become better writers, and they start to change the way that they think about education and how education works. I also want to kind of make this point, and I think this is an important one. Years ago, I was meeting with a possible donor. This is a man who had billions of dollars, and his father had billions of dollars. And when I explained this idea of authority to him, he simply looked at me and said, no, you either have that or you don't. And I was horrified. And of course, he had always had authority because it had been handed to him. I think for me, this pedagogy, part of the way that I know that it works, is when I see the A students continue to perform well, but suddenly my B students and my C students start to rise. And that's when we know it's working. So, some of my favorite students over the years are those ones who've come in and done something they never thought possible. Other questions, other thoughts? Yes, please.
What do you think would be a bigger challenge, say, turning students into wicked students or turning a teacher into wicked students?
That's an excellent question. What is a bigger challenge, turning students into wicked students or turning a teacher into a wicked teacher? Any thoughts on that? Anybody want to give that a try? I think the very fact that you asked the question answers it. I think it is difficult to turn teachers into wicked teachers because we, most of us, were the A students. We were the people who performed very well with traditional methods. We became very good at memorizing the questions. We became very good at anticipating what the instructor wanted, right? And we felt good in that circumstance, which is why we decided we were going to continue being in that circumstance. So this then asks us to think of the world a different way. But here's what we know. 94% of our students are not like us, okay? As I say in America, I don't know, I can't really say this, but because I don't know the culture quite as much, but I mean, in America, when I'm working with a classroom of professors, I said, let's face it, people, we're weird. We're not normal. You know, we work very hard for not a lot of money. And we're driven by a sense of service. We're driven by a sense of the love of the life of the mind. We're highly autonomous people. We don't like other people telling us what to do. So I think all of those are challenges to us making changes. You know, we learned on one model. It worked well for us. It makes perfect sense to turn around that model and hand it to the students, despite the fact that they're not like us. That's a very good question. I'm so glad you asked that. Yes and yes.
I try to look at from a GE perspective.
Yes.
In Hong Kong, I see students spend a lot of time in tuition schools.
Yes.
And the way why they did that was they tried to stay in their comfort zone.
Yes.
To learn the technique to score high marks to get into university.
Yes.
So what we need to do
Yes.
is to guide them to move beyond their comfort zone.
Yes.
And to be able to manage the dynamic world of tomorrow.
Yes.
So how will you incorporate these attributes in the DE?
Yeah. So the question is, how do we get students who stay in their comfort zones to recognize and understand the value of the complexity of the world? There's a couple of interesting ways to do that. One is to bring alumni or even just people in the community who do real work and face real problems into the classroom or into the university and have them talk. And at least again in the United States, and forgive me, I don't know if this translates, but what we find is that the younger the alums are, the more recent the graduates are, the more the students listen to what they're having to say. So that's one technique. And the other technique is to just constantly change what we do in the classroom, to let students know that, listen, memorization, important. You need to do that. These basic skills, important. You need to be able to do that. But I want you to know that there's going to be this other part of the class. You've never seen a problem like this before. Maybe one of the examples I used yesterday in my workshop is every Monday morning, the first thing you do on Monday morning is you give them a wicked problem. And they spend half an hour working on it in groups trying to figure it out. But then they get used to that idea that this is how it works. This is what we do here. This is valued. The main thing that I want to say is the rhetoric is saying, I care about this. This is very important and you need to know this. That doesn't work. It's important, we should do that, but really only when they do something are they really going to learn it, are they really going to believe it, is it really going to have an impact on the way that they think. Please.
Yes. This is Stephanie from Yuzhong Community College.
Hi,
Thank you, Professor Hanstedt, for sharing a very inspiring keynote speech.
My pleasure.
Along the same line, we also try to put a lot of effort, including community practices like UNICEF.
Yes.
We try to take the students to join those activities,
yes.
and also we took the students to American Embassy to witness the president's election. So that is actually the same line that we try to do. But then under the context in Hong Kong, we have quite some. As a wicked listener, I hope I could pose a question that might be a little bit challenging, because under Hong Kong situation, GE courses, for example, English, as you mentioned, writing, English is also under the umbrella of general education. Yeah. While we try to incorporate these elements in the English courses, at the end we have to we have to follow the PILO, the intended learning outcomes that we commit to. Yeah. So how can you share some examples in US, how?
There is a cultural difference, I think. And I do remember the very first time that I was in Hong Kong, and I did a workshop with a gentleman named Joe Cheney, who was at Chinese University of Hong Kong. Perhaps some of you know him. He's a wonderful human being. And we came up and we threw out all these wonderful, creative, imaginative ideas. And we got people listening very politely, and then at the end, somebody raised their hand and said, "That's very good, but," and they gave exactly what you just gave me. We were not allowed to do that because we need to make sure that the classes are uniform across the board. Okay. Now, part of the response I want to give is I think in the United States, there is the recognition increasingly that, and again, this is a cultural thing, so I don't know how it translates or does not, but the recognition increasingly that even if we have common standards from course to course, instructor to instructor, or even class to class, based upon the chemistry of the students and the dynamics that arrive, there is only a degree of uniformity that we're going to get. Okay? We should aim for that, but we need to recognize that absolute consistency and uniformity probably doesn't exist in our context. Okay? So that's part of the answer I would give. I would ask, perhaps this is something worth studying for different instructors and different programs to do the same thing and to measure the results and see how consistent they are or aren't. I think the other element I would encourage is somehow for institutions to create space for experimentation and innovation. So perhaps there are 10 courses teaching it one way, but maybe there are 2 additional courses that are the innovation courses, and they are like a little laboratory. And we're going to run an experiment here. We're going to try this new technique that Dr. So-and-so used, and it worked really well, so let's see if we can replicate it. And let's see what the data shows us about how the students learn. Or that somehow there be a conversation room made at the table for an instructor to come in and say, "Listen, I know I'm supposed to do it this way. I tried this new thing. It seemed very dynamic. Can we think about how these measures work?" Okay, that's a very imperfect answer. I apologize for that. I think it's a very good question, but I also, it's tricky for me to answer because in the United States, this idea of individualism is so very powerful. So, I mean, if you think faculty here are autonomous, boy. So, I don't know where we are in time.
Okay, thanks for the questions, and thanks